report. All right, we move on to item number 8, post-wildfire flooding update. Welcome, Ed.
Good afternoon. Apologies for having to walk all the way down here a little late. Ed Shank, Stormwater Manager. Good afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council. This will be our monthly update on the post-wildfire update, if it ever loads. Figure if I just hit it 3 times, I'm sure nothing bad will happen. All right, so we have the usual team here, some of us at least, today to go over some of the updates for this month. Just a quick set of objectives. We'll go over the Spruce Wash updates for the museum fire, the Schultz Creek updates for Pipeline West fire or Pipeline fire, a little bit of discussion on the spring flood mitigation planning and update, brief discussion on snowmelt impacts to flooding, and then obviously plenty of time for discussion and questions. Again, overall map, to keep this very short, you can see the footprint for both the 2022 pipeline fire and the 2019 museum fire. Those are the 2 ones we are talking about today. Obviously, there are other fires, Tunnel, Haywire as well, that are outside of the city boundary. For Spruce Wash, we do have that new hydrology and flood modeling that does indicate that we still have an elevated flood risk for both Grandview and Sunnyside. With that in mind, we are still moving forward with those bond projects. That's a Proposition 441 that are in design. We do have pretty good progress. We're getting to about 30% designs for most of those projects, and those will be expected in May. We do have that technical advisory committee that meets weekly, and then also focus groups for specific projects as needed. Next one up, I believe, I hope Mac's here. Mac, are you online? All right, well, I'll run it for Mac. We do have those 7 projects that are in design, going from upstream to downstream. That is the reconstruction of Grandview Avenue. Excellent. I'll let someone a little bit more knowledgeable than me speak. That's always a great idea. Mac, you want to take the next few?
Oh, yep.
Thanks.
Sorry I'm late there. I was catching up with a couple other things. I'm Mac McNamara. I'm a Capital Improvements Project Manager. I think Ed started this slide off here. This is not a new slide, something we've brought to council before. On the right is a context map for the 7 projects we've identified. We've got 2 channel improvements projects, 2 conveyance structures that will be upsized, a detention basin, Grandview roadway improvements, and we plan to construct a permanent inlet structure at Arroyo Seco. So the next slide covers project delivery and some of our consultants we have on board. We're delivering these projects through a CMAR, which we've discussed before. That's also known as a CMAR. So a CMAR has been selected through a qualification-based process. We are working through negotiations right now on a design services contract. Our CMAR will retain a public relations firm to help with communications. We retain 4 separate design consultants for the suite of projects, and we have a survey consultant and a geotech consultant right now in the field working to support design for all 7 projects. The next slide I have here is for a project delivery schedule. This is somewhat ambitious, but we think it's feasible. We plan to bring GMP number 1 to council on July 3rd. This will be for utility relocates in Grandview. And we'll most likely start this in monsoons. Final plans for all the projects will be completed by December 23rd this year. And we plan to bring GMP number 2 in February of 2024. This could have the remaining 6 projects. We're still trying to figure that out. Construction for those remaining 6 projects would start in the spring of 2024 and would continue through the fall of 2025. We're thinking 3 projects would be in 2024 and 3 others would probably be in 2025. And that's all I have.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, Council. Sam Beckett, Section Director, Public Works. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the parkway basins that are in the process of construction at this point. It is a county-led project. As we're trying to get all these different projects done, there's just no way we can get everything accomplished from one entity. So teamwork has been key in this. As we'll go through the quick bullet points here, the county project has been awarded to their contractor. We'll allow them to make those announcements. Construction equipment will be in the area. So if you're working up Paradise, Parkway is on the right-hand side. We will see some equipment in that area. There will also be access in the channel from the very end of Paradise. So just one of those kind of heads up for the community to watch for that as it comes into place. There is utility relocates and tree work that has begun because this process is moving rapidly, as we'll get to this last bullet here, and that'll kind of explain why. There is still in process the city-county intergovernmental agreement for maintenance and operations in the development of this. Still a lot of pieces to be worked out, but we knew the project had to kick off. The funds have to be expended by the 30th of June, so a lot of pieces are kind of just moving very fluidly as we work through this process here. And then the County Flood Control District will be providing all the direct communications and updates to the residents in there, as it's their project, they're leading the effort, and we don't want to mix up any information as it goes out to the group. And the last piece, the most important piece, and why this project is moving so quickly, is the Natural Resources Conservation Service funding has to be expended by the 30th. And that's why this project is kicking off and it's moving so rapidly. We're excited to have it done. We're hoping to get it done before the monsoons move in. But it's just one of those pieces that teamwork is how we're going to get it accomplished. So, and I'll kick this over, I think it's back to Ed. Thank you all.
Okay, so now we're gonna move over to Schultz Creek, so the west side. Let's see here. So the detention basins that we did complete this fall, they've seen some use actually this month. Quite a bit of water going in them from that snow melt, the little bit of rain on snow that we had. So good to see those basins operating as they should. We also have that project, so the Schultz Creek Channel Stabilization Project between the basins and Highway 180. We'll go into a little bit of detail on that. The Highway 180 crossing, we're past the 30% design, working with the Technical Advisory Committee. We do have one of the designers here today. If there's any questions, we'll talk a little bit on that, and then also Francis Short Pond dredging. So for the Schultz Creek Channel, there are 2 projects. We mentioned this before. Just to give a quick update, we did receive, or we are receiving, the Emergency Watershed Protection EWP funding. This is that Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS funding, very similar to what the county has for the Parkway Basin. That is funded at a little over $630,000 plus $49,000 for technical assistance. That would be design assistance. We'll meet that city match, which is a 25% match. Either through the stormwater rate or through DFFM if we're able to get that eligible for state reimbursement. That is moving very quickly. We're moving through design right now. We need to, like the other project, like the Parkway Basins, we need to move rather quickly. We have until October 15th to complete that project. So moving quickly through design as well as property acquisitions, which I think you'll hear about next meeting, next work session. The county project, Eldon Lookout Road, that's also moving through design. They're very close to 90% design. They have their construction service firm as well on board. That's Bannicky. They should be doing construction, I would assume, this summer, if not fall, moving quickly on those. Both projects are important because they're designed to reduce the sediment and downstream debris impacts in Coconino Estates and the rest of the city. So really, these 2 working in concert really should reduce some of those sediment impacts that we'll see as the water moves through the basins and then down towards Highway 180. Schultz Creek at Highway 180, moving quickly towards that 60% design. So a lot moving on there. Also, no adverse impact analysis is going on as well. So we should hope to have both completed by June. So that'll be 100% designs. The no adverse impact is a little bit tricky just due to the fact that we're working not just with Schultz Creek, but also the regional floodway of the Rio Flag. So we do have to work through that FEMA special flood hazard area. So working through the design on that with the understanding that we also have to get the model correct. Funding obviously is an ongoing challenge. The hope is to avoid federalization of this project, so to hope to avoid federal dollars if possible, as that would drastically delay the project due to compliance and regulatory environment of federal projects. Property acquisition discussion is still ongoing. We're talking both the Mount Calvary Lutheran School and Church, as well as Museum of Northern Arizona. Good progress with both of that. Like I mentioned, you'll be hearing from Bryce next week about property acquisition for this project. There is a little bit of an issue with a restrictive covenant on the M&A property, the Museum of Northern Arizona. They have what they call a nature preserve on that, so that we'll have to work through that covenant restriction moving forward. French's Short Pond dredging, kind of same story as we had last month, unfortunately. It's still on hold due to the snowpack and the current condition. So we do have an overflow condition at French's Short Pond, even with the drain fully open, just due to the amount of water that we're seeing come through with that snow melt. So last I checked about 15 minutes ago, we're about 0.3 feet of overflow on that spillway. A picture of it right here. So still moving water through there. Once we get that water a little bit lower, we can get some of our JOCs to come in, take a look, to give us a bid for that dredge project. But obviously a little bit slow, but we will get there with that, and we'll continue to assess the situation as we move forward. Spring runoff, so kind of changing topics slightly away from our typical post-wildfire flood update to typical spring, if you will. Snowmelt runoff, obviously rather large snowpack we have up there. As of like last week, it was about 32 inches of snow water equivalent. So that's the equivalent liquid amount of water up on the peaks in Snowslide Canyon based on the Snowtell site. So quite a bit of water, and that's slowly melting off. Thankfully, it's mostly slow. Stormwater continues to monitor our stream gauges as well as the NWS predictive modeling, so the National Weather Service. And we react as needed with Public Works, pros, others, as we see issues out there. So obviously, you've seen in the news or heard, some of those low water crossings in other areas that have seen some high water. So as to date, we've been pretty lucky. It's been way better than some years, like 1993. The flood impacts have been fairly moderate at a community level, but there is continued somewhat small threat of rain on snow events, and there have been some properties that have been damaged, unfortunately, due to some of this high water. On the good news front, Upper Lake Mary is full, as you probably know, and flowing very robustly down into Lower Lake Mary, and there is water in Walnut Canyon below that. Just some pictures to go with it. This is Fox Glen Park, March 22nd of this year. Obviously pretty high water coming through from the Rio Flag. And then another photo, this is from March 19th. This is Schultz Creek, actually, going into that uppermost basin. So just showing those basins working. You can kind of see the braided nature of the stream. That means it's dropping off sediment, it's dropping off debris. So sediment and debris that we normally see down at Francis Short Pond or in the community is being retained up there in those basins. So they're doing a great job so far this spring. Great to see them being used so quickly after construction. With that, I think I'll turn it back over. I believe Sam's going to take the last slide and kind of a whirlwind tour here today.
Yes, Councilmember Matthews has a question.
Thank you, Mayor. Ed, I was reading some comments, on social media and stuff about some sewer issues with Fox Glen and that flooding. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to it. Obviously, we have our sewer collections group as well as our wastewater folks that probably be better to identify the issues in a little more detail than I can. So what we have with a lot of these older sewer mains is a lot of them go in the channels, in the washes, and we have what's called I&I. So that's infiltration and, I almost missed the other I, inflow, yes, thank you. So what happens is when you have a little crack in the concrete casing or you have a hole in the top of a manhole, you're going to have some of that ionized, so you'll have some of that flow come down. And we're seeing that all throughout the city. Now, Fox Glen being a rather low area, like any sort of sump condition, that's where you're going to see a backflow. So you get enough of that water to come down very quickly, especially on the rain and snow events, and you may see an area where you'll actually have a little bit of backflow from the sewer into the surface system. So obviously not ideal. It's something that's definitely being addressed by our wastewater collections group. They've been working on that for the last week and also monitoring other areas. So we are working on making sure that backflow is not continuing, and then also doing water quality testing to make sure that there's not an issue with E. coli or anything else to the public.
And I was just going to ask you about the health concerns. So besides just the contamination of the water, just people out walking their dog or strolling around and maybe not being aware that there's this contamination, is that a concern at all at this point?
We're monitoring it. I don't have an exact water quality report for that. That would probably be a question for wastewater collections. I mean, one of the good news, if you will, is the amount of surface water, just storm water that's coming through, does tend to flush it pretty quickly. So the amount of wastewater compared to the amount of typical surface water, snow melt, is very small.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah.
All right, well, believe it or not, I know there's snow on the ground, but spring is just around the corner, so we're told. Unless you're around here this Wednesday or Thursday, you may think otherwise. Short-term mitigations are definitely a topic that we discussed even today. Ed led a meeting to start scoping out what that looks like this year as we go into potential monsoon season here this year. We'll see what the weather brings us, but really trying to figure out what do we need. I think on the plus side, there was a lot of activity last year in people ensuring that their mitigations were in good shape. I think that happened throughout the entire season with the intensity of monsoon that we saw. And what we're seeing now is most of those mitigations are still intact. They're holding up. They're in honestly a pretty good location for most of them. And there's a few areas where people have opened up walkways, things like that, that they'll have to close up this year. But we don't see a massive operation this year in the spring to get all these homes mitigated because everything is in a pretty stable condition at this point. So we'll continue to work through that as the snow melts. We're going to go out and evaluate and make sure that everything seems to be where it needs to be. And we'll also be distributing the new modeling. It'll be coming out through Ed as that's ready for the group. The flood alert thresholds will be evaluated. They are every year. It's just one of those pieces we do as a due diligence to ensure that the flood modeling and the flood alerts align and that we're given enough time and notice dependent on what the modeling is telling us. So those pieces are coming up. It's one of those things we do every year just to ensure that those stay accurate. Some of the big items that we're looking at this year, if needed, will be some of the pieces that stormwater is really going to be supporting this year as their stormwater rates come into play here, is the sandbag purchases, the barrier purchases. We've even got some new barrier coming in to try and help out. The engineering assessments, individual assistance for elderly and disabled. That's always one of those pieces we want to leave on the table. And then the one thing here is that number that we've established a couple of years ago is going to continue on with the 213-2102. As we get into spring, we'll start collecting those calls. We'll have a smaller, I don't want to call it a call center. I hate using call center unless we're in a disaster situation, but we'll call it a service line. And as those needs arise, you can call that service line. We'll get you set up with an engineer or whoever it might be to come out to do those individual home assessments and help you understand what your risk may or may not be in your particular area. But these are the big ticket items that we're looking at right now from a mitigation standpoint.
I have a quick question.
Yeah,
Will we be engaging volunteers again, do you think?
we sure will.
And are we contracting with United Way?
I hope so. Yeah, I think that's the plan. Steve Thompson is the volunteer coordinator for the city. He was in our meeting this morning and truly an extraordinary person, and he'll definitely help coordinate all those items as they come up. We haven't started scheduling those yet, honestly, because we're not seeing that massive need. If we start seeing a huge influx of needs and wants from the community, then we'll start looking at what that might take to ramp up some of those volunteer efforts, but definitely in the forefront of our minds right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. If nothing else, I'll give it back over to Ed to close out the show.
That's an easy slide. If there's any extra questions, we got a team here today, not just the people who have spoken, but we do have our designer and a few others as well. So happy to take any questions, discussion, comments, etc. We're here.
Thank you. And I know we will have some questions. I'm wondering whether Shannon can give the answer to the question regarding Fox Glen. Is Shannon on?
Shannon might be able to join us, but I think Lisa Deem is also available. I see that she's in the chat. And Lisa, if you want to speak to this, that would be great.
Yes, good afternoon. We were notified of the SSO, the sewer overflow, on Monday, and immediately parks closed off the affected areas. Actually, it was last week, and there's signage at the site. There's been social media posts, and the park is closed, or the areas that are affected are closed, so no one can accidentally walk their dog unless they go past all the tape and the closure signs that are in place at the park. As we speak, they are mitigating that, cleaning that up, and it should be open soon. I don't know the date when. It depends on when the new material. They have to actually replace the material, the name of the wood chips and the padding, especially at the playground. So I don't have a date or a time yet that that'll be open, but I do know that they are actively mitigating it now.
Thank you, Lisa. And I see Councilmember Matthews has a question.
Thank you, Mayor. And it's not for Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Ed, you said that there was one of our planners or designers about the 180 design. Can he come down or she come down and just speak a little bit more about what that looks like and how that's flowing?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll have Kayla Fleischman from SWI Ardura, and she can take some questions or comments.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. As Ed said, my name is Kayla. I work for SWI Ardura. Is there a particular question that you have, Councilmember Matthews, regarding the Highway 180 project?
Just basic concept of what the design is starting to look like and what you're working on.
Sure. So I'll start upstream. So just to the east of Highway 180, near the American Conservation Experience, we are going to reroute a portion of Schultz Creek to go to the northwest instead of routing through the existing stormwater infrastructure under ADOT's right-of-way. It'll go to the northwest, and then it will direct across ADOT's right-of-way by way of a box culvert or an arch culvert. That's yet to be determined. And it will flow through that conveyance structure, through the Mount Calvary Lutheran Church property, and discharge at the Rio de Flag. And there will be armoring to the channel on both ends of that new box culvert infrastructure. You're welcome.
What does armoring mean?
Sure. So armoring can look like a lot of different things. It could be a shotcrete channel. It could be a gabion mattress, which is like a steel cage with rock riprap inside. And it could be grouted riprap. There's a couple different options that we're evaluating.
And the purpose of that is to further detain any debris?
Yeah, the purpose of that is to prevent scour of the channel.
Okay, thank you.
The current culvert that we have now is downstream, obviously, that we all have gone out and witnessed. And some of the comments that I've heard from a lot of the residents there is that the size was one of the issues. So is this new culvert design designed for potential 500-year flood events and other things that are a magnitude that maybe we haven't seen yet before, but can handle any of those?
Sure. Councilmember Matthews, the thought there is that we are designing to a particular storm event. We cannot design to the 500-year, as you noted. That flow is far too large. The infrastructure would be far too expensive and far too large to fit. But we are evaluating what that design storm is that we're mitigating to, and it's all based off J.E. Fuller's modeling efforts in the post-wildfire condition for the Pipeline West.
Thank you. Other questions? I have a couple. Ed, I believe, do you know when we're going to have the modeling for the Schultz watershed?
Yeah, great question. So we do have a preliminary model from J.E. Fuller for the Schultz Creek watershed, and that was something we talked about at great length today, actually, in our short-term mitigation meeting. So we do have the preliminary maps. Our concern with publicly presenting those is you have to remember the difference between the map that we provided last year for the sandbags and the barriers, which is assuming there's no basins, and the model we have now, which has those Schultz Creek basins. Obviously, the difference is the basins. What we are concerned with is that we have a series of flood events that are similar to 2021, where for Spruce Wash, we had 3 flood events within 5 days. Or a type of event that we saw in 2022, but not here in the city, on the county side. So on the county side, Wapaki Trails, some of those other watersheds, saw multiple back-to-back-to-back flood events. So you saw one, you saw another, you saw another. So our concern with sharing the new model results is, again, the model is not predictive. The model just shows you what you put into it. So what we're putting into it is a 2-inch and 45-minute storm, one time, for those basins. So that we can show that, and we can show that to the public, and we can show that to everybody. We don't want to mitigate to that, though, because the problem that we can have, and we likely will have, because we saw it in 2021 in Spruce, we saw it last year on the east side, is let's say you have a storm, and that first storm, it goes exactly toward the model. You have your basins empty, they fill, you don't have any flooding downstream, or you have very little in some areas, you have moderate in others, and then it starts draining, but it takes 36 to 48 hours for that to drain. So it starts draining, and you have another storm the next day, and it's not drained, well, then you're gonna have that same flood event that we are showing from last year with those flood models. So we're very concerned with showing a model that we think might be overly optimistic if you have back-to-back events. So we do not really want to share a model that says, okay, yeah, the flood threat is a lot lower for parts of Coconino Estates, in other areas it's still the same, and then you have a flood that's the same as what we were showing last year, if that makes sense. So we're concerned about being overly optimistic with a flood model like that. Really what's going to make a big difference is that Highway 180 culvert. Once we have that in place, that is the true flood mitigation, or end flood mitigation for Stavana Way, for Coconino Estates, for the downtown areas. Right now with those basins, just the basins by themselves, we're at an incomplete kind of temporary condition. So there is some concern from the larger group that sharing the flood model, the new flood model, might be giving too much of an optimistic opinion if we have those back-to-back-to-back flood events, which would really mirror what we already have out there in the public for last year, if that makes sense.
So what would be involved to create 2 models, to create one at the 2-inch, and then to create another one showing an event coming right after that?
Well, we have that. That's the model from last year. So the model from last year would be the same if we had 2 back-to-back events. That would look exactly like what we are showing for last year. So that's why we, as a group, we're really thinking that the model from last year is the model that we still show for short-term mitigations, and that's what we recommend. Again, short-term mitigations are not required. This is just our recommendation to the community. So if people want to mitigate to a different level, if they want to mitigate down or up, that is obviously their prerogative. But our professional advice is that we mitigate to that J.E. Fuller 2-inch model from 2022. We do think that is the most realistic and most practical, pragmatic model. In most cases, most houses are already mitigated to that based on the work last year.
So just to confirm, the model from last year includes the detention basins upstream?
No. So to be clear, the model from last year does not include the detention basins. Why I say it's the same model if you have back-to-back is if you have back-to-back storms, you have to assume those detention basins are overwhelmed. So essentially, you're taking them back off the table. So we'd have that same flood type as what we show without detention basins, so that makes sense. And I think these are great questions, and this is why we're a little concerned about sharing two different models, is I think it gets very confusing very quickly to people. They see two different things and they're like, well, which one's right? And really what we're saying is either one can be right. It depends on the types of storms we see. It depends on type of weather we see, the soil conditions. There's a lot that goes into it. So really to be pragmatic and to also to be as concerned with life and safety as we can, we really do think that the 2022 model, which is the model that is currently out in public and currently mitigated to, is the model to design for until the Highway 180 culvert is put in. Once that's in, then we can really, with some confidence, come back here with yet a new model that will really show a very enhanced flood mitigation. But our real concern here is that we show something too optimistic. We do have back-to-back storms, which we've seen a lot of in these last couple of years, and then people are caught off guard. That's what we're concerned about.
And just one more question. Do you anticipate, you indicated that there's already debris coming into the detention basins. Do you anticipate cleaning those out, needing to clean those out before monsoon season?
We hope to clean them out. I do not believe we need at this point. It's not a very large portion of the volume. So we have about 60 acre-feet of volume, which is a tremendous amount of volume. We're seeing a very small percentage of that that's being taken up by this new sand, silt, ash, and debris, so trees, logs, etc. The nice thing about that is not only do we probably not need to clean it, but if we want to clean it, we probably can see if we have internal crews that can do that instead of contracting out. So really it's going to be a question of access, how long that stays muddy. If we are able to dry out in June, we can definitely see if we can get some crews out there with some loaders and kind of skim off the top, if you will, get it back to where it should be for monsoon season. But yeah, we'll be looking at that pretty seriously.
Thank you. Council, last call. We do have a public commenter. Laura Kessler.
Hi, thank you, Mayor and Council. Actually, I have more questions than comments. Regarding what we just heard, I'm wondering if there's any way that, and I'm speaking for Coconino Estates because that's where I live, but of course, you know, I'm concerned about all the areas, but I'll just focus on Coconino Estates today. So is it possible for Coconino Estates to have a temporary short-term mitigation? I know Stefano Way has Jersey barriers, and they actually have had a worse situation regarding funding or regarding flooding than Coconino Estates. But you know, with the snowpack and the possible saturation of melting snow and then back-to-back events, I just want to make sure if the worst-case scenario does happen, like it kind of did back in '93, and there were no burn scars at the time. Can we get something more than just individual assistance from the engineers? And I love that idea with the phone number and people coming out and helping the neighborhood individually on an individual basis is what it sounds like. But can we do it more on a neighborhood basis? And as much as I do not like Jersey barriers because they're so ugly and they kind of bring down property values, I'm sure, is there something we can do that might be a little more planned than just going to each household? Now, my neighbors have made their own sandbag channels between the houses, but then, of course, the water's just going to go right through to the next neighborhood, Lower Coconino Estates, which is Cutch Drive, and I forget the other street down there. But I'm just wondering if there's a little more short-term, if we could have a little more short-term temporary mitigation for the entire neighborhood instead of just individually. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
I can try to answer that. Just to clarify, you're talking about Mead Lane?
Yeah, I'm talking to.
Okay. So there is an issue with Mead Lane. Probably mostly aware that it is kind of a sump condition, somewhat similar to Stavana Way. They're both sump conditions, which the sump, Scott Overton puts it way better than I do. It's the bathtub effect. I mean, it really is a low ponding area where the water collects, and it takes a very long time for it to get back out of that area. So for Mead Lane, you know, we can look into that. Yeah, we can. I mean, we can definitely talk with our engineers, see if there isn't something that we can provide. Short-term mitigation being, you know, obviously in the line of more than a year. But yeah, let me get back to council and to the community as well. And Scott, if you want to speak to that as well. But I don't have a good answer for you right now on that one. Maybe Scott does. But it's definitely something we can look into. Talkington's a little more difficult. That is more of a kind of similar to what we see in Spruce Wash, where it is sloped, so it is actually moving water. But we can look into that as well.
Yeah, Ed, if you don't mind, let me add a finer point, and I apologize for my tardiness. I was in a conflicting meeting and appreciate the team being here and the residents listening to the update. I think it's important we talk about, and Scott Overton, for the record, I apologize, Public Works Director. The question's a fair one, and I want to step back and talk for just a couple seconds on the modeling. And the modeling is really important because that's what informs our short-term mitigations. I think as a system, we have not completed the entire system. The Schultz Creek sediment basins are spectacular in the way they're going to work, and they're going to do good things. It's imperative that we finish that system out, and we've talked about that. We know that. We're pursuing that. The bathtub effect that Ed is referring to is the different type of condition than we have on the Spruce Wash side. So the engineering team has wrestled this concept and this concern from day one. That sump condition and those homes that are lower in elevation than the actual elevation of the Rio is creating that effect where the stormwater is overwhelmed, it comes into that low-lying community, and then it starts to build into the community. So while it's counterintuitive and maybe even difficult to consider, I think the modeling and the engineer's work has been solid in the fact that you can protect structures and you can protect primary residences and try to do as best possible job to mitigate that, but those floodwaters will continue to fill that neighborhood, you know, in a bathtub type effect until it can find the Rio to flag. And that's why it's imperative that we get that Rio moved across 180 and across the private parcels. If you were to add barrier to that equation or more sandbags, all we're really doing is displacing that impact or that pain to a neighboring property. And we're going to start just filling the bathtub a little bit faster. So it's unfortunate, but the same type of mitigations really aren't as effective as they are in a flowing condition as we are seeing in the Spruce Wash. So the hydraulics are a little bit nuanced, and I think we've continued to advocate and be open to trying to understand that model and talking through that model. I am at a place where I am confident to say, as the TAC and the engineering team evaluates these models and we're finally getting really good data, even refined with mitigations, we're going to be able to share those with the public, and we're going to be able to kind of put an asterisk next to it. And Ed's comments are spot on. If the basins are full and we have a compromised system, we need to take that into account. But I think our residents will understand that it's a compromised system until we can continue those mitigations. And so let us go back and work with the TAC and make sure we're all in agreement and the engineers are in agreement that, you know, it is okay to release the models at a point certain, and maybe put an asterisk right next to that conversation to say, you know, this is in the event the basins are fully functional and operational and not filled. And, you know, this engaged community has been excellent about working with us and coming to our public forums and understanding the data that we're working with. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, some of the smartest engineers in the Southwest are working this problem as quickly as possible. And I apologize for my long-windedness, but I think there are some opportunities for us to share data. And I think there's a learning opportunity for all of us to really understand what short-term mitigations can do and what they may actually do to harm the community even further. And that's likely not what we want to do. So much different problem on Pipeline West, but we're moving in the right direction. I'm confident of that. So we welcome the conversation, we welcome the dialogue, and these are really good questions for us to take back to the TAC and work through, because it's good feedback. So keep those coming. We ask the public to keep coming, but the hydraulics are very different on this west side than they are in Spruce Wash.
1 second along these lines. Residents have also asked about a community meeting in the neighborhood. Do we have anything, any calendar dates?
Yeah, so we had one, I want to say 3, maybe 4 weeks ago now for Pipeline West. We do not have one on the books. I anticipate we will have one as the short-term mitigation group continues their work and gets their recommendations to the group in April to you all at the April work session. I would suspect you're going to see public communication through Sarah's office, and those have included, you know, community meetings and neighborhood meetings here at Chambers, and I would expect us to be doing the same type of activity to really disseminate the information as fairly and quickly as possible to a larger audience. So not scheduled, but I would imagine we're going to start seeing those on the books for May so that people can prepare for the monsoon season in July.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Matthews.
Thank you, Mayor. Scott, your division's probably the most popular, well-focused in the last 6 months of any other division, so I appreciate all of your team's hard work and yours. I hadn't really heard before about this bathtub issue. Hopefully our planning and zoning don't let new developments have the same effect. But is there a requirement, do you think, for like pumping out when it fills up like that because it has to reach up to the Rio de Flag, or will this be all mitigated once this project is complete? I mean, do we ever get away from that issue where they're lower than the Rio de Flag?
Yeah, excellent comments, council member. Thank you. I'll kind of take those in order if I can. One, it's a much bigger team than Public Works. I appreciate the comment and the support, but I will assure you, it's private sector, it's water services, it's a ton of work by a lot of folks, and we're just one small piece, but I appreciate the comment. The pumping idea, it was discussed early on, right after the fire. You know, I think the practicality of that became difficult. We've seen some residents that will build sandbags at their residence and maybe protect their primary structure and use smaller pumps to pump if water were to go beyond their sandbag walls. But on a grand scale, if you think about the creek and the amount of water, you know, physically pumping it is really pretty unrealistic in this flow setting. I think our laser focus has been on completing the system and getting it across 180 and across those parcels to, as Kayla suggested, back to the Rio. That's where it wants to go. The last point is, boy, I apologize, I had it too. The sump pump. There was one more point you made, I'm sorry.
Will it all be mitigated once the project is complete?
Thank you, I apologize. It's a really important nuance. The model and the really smart people in the room will tell you Mother Nature is undefeated. And we are designing to the biggest storm that we can fit in, that makes financial sense, that makes practical sense from a physical standpoint. I know that it could be overrun. I think we're going to continue to message that there will be a storm that could overwhelm the system, but we're really trying to address the storms that are most typical that we're going to see in the area. And then the real big wild card for us is post-wildfire recovery conditions. So as that forest heals and we see good growth in the forest, that should help this equation. But I can't with good confidence walk up here and tell you that we will mitigate our way out of every problem, and it would really be a misstatement. So we've been pretty clear about that, and we'll continue to stand. We're going to do the best work possible, but you know, in a large event, it will be overrun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember McCarthy.
Hi, Scott.
Good afternoon.
Did I understand you correctly saying that there's neighborhoods that are actually lower than the Rio de Flag is in their vicinity?
You know, thank you for the question. I will say, I don't remember the floor elevation of the Rio, but the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the Rio today, there's a flood map that shows them in a floodway. So the actual floor elevation, the street elevation, and the flow of the Rio, this water is coming through these neighborhood areas to get to the Rio. So clearly the bottom of the Rio, the bank, is lower than the floor elevation of a home nearby. But it's lower than the elevation of 180, it's lower than the elevation of Schultz Creek, it's getting down there, but we are still seeing that ponding condition or that bathtub effect in those low-lying areas, you know, north of Francis Short Pond all the way up to this location at the 180 crossing. So it's exact elevation, we'd have to get you that data. I know Ed can help me with that, but it's certainly a lower elevation, and that's why we're seeing that ponding effect as it gets to the Rio.
So it seems if they're a little bit higher than the Rio, that you would want to create a drainage path from the low-lying areas out to the Rio, but that may be difficult to do. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we're seeing it as it goes through properties and it sheet flows through the neighborhoods. It's finding its way to the Rio, and we see that today through small bar ditches or through private property. It's not discriminating on any properties. It's simply finding its way to the Rio. The engineering team is really directing that flow across 180 and into the Rio at a point that is upstream of that location. And I hope that's a fair assessment and a simplistic example. And I'm waiting for these engineers to throw something at me if I'm not getting it right.
So then after, if we get this improved to water across 180, then it won't flood these low-lying areas. The water will,
It'll reduce the risk.
yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
All right, we have another public commenter, Steve Poor.
Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council. Great to hear some conversation about a model, okay? But I kind of surprised to think that the citizens aren't smart enough to figure out what the range of outcomes could be. They lived through what God gave us. They know the probabilities are unpredictable. Just give us the information. And when Ed says it's last year's model didn't have the walls we built. Last year's model didn't even have they had water going from Savannah through the backyard of our south neighbors. That doesn't happen. That needs to be changed. Before the model was done, they talked about putting in the barriers where they eventually did at the apartments, okay? But they didn't run it all the way down the channel till halfway through the season. 2 or 3, I forget where it was, how they adjusted how things were gonna be. And lastly, Ed's part of a conversation about how we're gonna replace what little channel we put on Savannah Way by our own neighbors in the fire department to get the water off our street. And there's been an agreement, I understand, that Ed's been a part of the conversation, that there's going to be a bigger channel put in there. Why doesn't he put that in a model and share that with us? Why didn't we hear about it? I mean, is it going to be done or not? Ed?
Thanks, Steve. We are still under property negotiations with that property owner for the ditch, if you want to call it that, through Savannah Way. So there's nothing that we can publicly provide at this time, but we are working with our engineering team on that, as well as with real estate here in the city to get that property acknowledgement for the, if you want to call it a ditch, the ditch that will go through Savannah Way. That would mostly follow the same footprint of that temporary ditch that was dug by the neighbors during the flood event. So we're still working on that in the background, but until we have more to share, we haven't shared that publicly. Good points made on the walls have been made or built since that 2022 model. We do have various revisions of the 2022 model, so we do have models that show the walls and the short-term mitigations, et cetera. So got plenty there to work with, and again, we'll work with our TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, on what is shared. So I'll be working with Scott and many others on that. So feel free. I'm here for more questions or anything else. Thanks.
And you get the sense that the public would like the modeling sooner rather than later. You feel the urgency.
Oh, definitely, and I know that urgency very well. I am not a team of one, so that is definitely something that we'll work through our focus group on. So I do not make any decisions unilaterally, but we'll work on that. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.